There is always a time for everything, just neither a sign. Don't be afraid of an endless road. Never regret and never look back. You have to remember to feed your soul. There is always a joy.
Situated on the north banks of the River Tagus, the charm of Lisbon exists in its strong links to the past. Its renovated palaces, magnificent churches, and an impressive castle mirror the city's rich cultural heritage. Its eclectic blend of neighbourhoods, culture and architecture distinguish this capital city uniquely from the other European capitals and make it a truly fascinating and comprehensive city to visit. The Baixa district between Rossio and the river is known as Lisboa Pombellina. Surrounding buildings, which were rebuilt after the Great Earthquake by the order of the Marquess of Pombell, reflect the architectural taste of the end of the 18th century, and wide boulevards remind one of 19th century Paris. The Pombelline style was a Portuguese architectural style. It's considered as a secular, utilitarian architecture marked by pragmatism. Augusta Street in the Baixa district is one of the best examples of this architecture. Rua Augusta, like all successful streets, performs two key functions. It takes you somewhere, and you enjoy simply being on it. The street itself is beautiful, made up of Lisbon's famous black and white pavers, and designed in such a way that each intersection offered a view of the adjoining hillside neighbourhoods. These streets once housed all the city's banks and many of their tradespeople, including jewellers and shoemakers. The street is a huge sidewalk with cafes and shops along it, as well as temporary vendors. Baixa, literally translated as low, is situated in the gulf between the two main hills of the city and is the central business and shopping district of the capital. At the end of Rua Augusta is the Square of Commerce. A triumphal arch, a huge stone archway, leads to the Baixa's main pedestrianised street and Praça do Comércio. This arch, usually called the Arco da Rua Augusta, was designed by Verissimo da Costa. Supported by classical stone columns, despite its size, Lisbon's most famous arch appears very elegant and grand. Many statues adorn the arch itself and signify important moments in the city's distant past. The arch is decorated with statues of historical personalities like Vasco da Gama and the Marquess de Pombell. The square was named the Square of Commerce to indicate its new function in the economy of Lisbon. The symmetrical buildings of the square were filled with government bureaus that regulated customs and port activities. The main piece of the ensemble was the equestrian statue of King José I, inaugurated in 1775 in the centre of the square. This bronze statue, the first monumental statue dedicated to a king in Lisbon, was designed by Joaquim Machado de Castro, Portugal's foremost sculptor of the time. The tramroads of Lisbon are now used by about 200 wagons of the old type, many of them built before the First World War in Sheffield in the UK. Various wagons have been restored to their original shape and are used for guided tours by tourists in the capital. The large square was rebuilt following a symmetrical design, a rectangular square in the shape of a U, open towards the Tagus. The area was further developed with the building of a port and shipbuilding facilities that regulated commerce between Portugal and other parts of Europe and its colonies in Africa, Asia and America. Bairro Alto is a picturesque working-class quarter dating from the 16th century that's traditionally been the city's bohemian haunt of artists and writers. Literally translated, High District, it's of no surprise that this traditional area is found atop one of the many hills of the city. Thanks to its rich history and great power during the Age of Discovery, Lisbon is packed with interesting historical, cultural and religious sites. Many of Lisbon's most beautiful buildings come in the form of churches. All showcase Portuguese architecture at its finest. The Praça Luís de Camões is a transition square between the Chada and Bairro Alto districts of the city. It contains a memorial statue to Luís de Camões, a 16th century poet, regarded as one of the greatest in the history of Portugal. The statue is mounted on a pedestal, surrounded by 8 important Portuguese scientists and authors. In this maze of narrow cobbled streets lives a thriving local community, bustling with grocer shops, butchers and bakers during the day, where washing hangs from ornate wrought iron balconies, and housewives go about their daily duties in the time-honoured way. At night, everything changes. Shops close and bars and restaurants, invisible during the daylight hours, open up in a multitude of guises. The historical neighbourhoods of central Lisbon are perfect for visitors to the Portuguese capital to experience for themselves. The Bairro Alto is one of the most characteristic and attractive neighbourhoods in the city. To discover its streets, lanes and alleys, it's essential to explore it. This is a unique experience within Lisbon, packed with secrets ripe for discovery. Lisbon's architecture has undergone many influences and changes. Due to contact with a great part of the world for over 800 years, around Portugal, it's clear to see buildings that could have been built by French, Arab or Brazilian people, but always faithful to the Portuguese nature and culture. Lisbon's trams aren't the only way to get up its steep hills. 3 funicular railways and an elevator are fitted in convenient spots, taking one up to spectacular miradouros or belvederes. One of the city's best-loved landmarks, known as the Elevator of Carmo, This extraordinary structure was built at the turn of the century by the Portugal-born French architect Raoul de Mesnier du Ponsard, an apprentice of Gustave Eiffel, explaining the structure's similarities to Paris's Eiffel Tower. It connects downtown to Bairro Alto. It was opened in 1902 when it was steam-powered. Then in 1907 it became electrical and was the only vertical elevator in Lisbon in public service. Made entirely of cast iron and embellished with filigree, the lifts within the tower go up to 45 meters and carry 25 persons in each of their 2 cabins. In a romantic neo-Gothic design, this elevator is an unforgettable experience. The lift only takes about 1 minute to reach the top, whereupon visitors tumbled out onto the walkways to get a first glance of the magnificent view. The Avenida da Liberdade is linked to the story of the city. In the first years of the 19th century, Portugal was invaded by the troops of Napoleon Bonaparte, and King John VI of Portugal temporarily fled to Brazil. Considerable property was pillaged by the invaders. The city felt the full force of the Portuguese liberal upheavals, beginning its tradition of cafes and theatres. In 1879, the Avenida da Liberdade was opened, replacing a previous public garden. The boulevard, built in 1879, forms a connecting axis between the old 18th century quarters of the Baixa and the northern parts of the city, which developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. With the idea of building a prestigious and elegant street, Lisbon turned its gaze, as was often the case, to Paris. A counterpart to the Champs-Élysées was planned for Portugal's capital city. This monument is homage to the Marquess of Pombell, the Prime Minister responsible for the rebuilding of Lisbon following the Great Earthquake, showing him standing on a column with his hand on a lion, the symbol of power, and his eyes directed to the downtown area that he rebuilt. The base is decorated with allegorical images depicting Pombell's political, educational, and agricultural reforms. Broken blocks of stone at the foot of the monument and tidal waves flooding the city symbolize the effects of the earthquake. Today, the avenue still has a certain elegance, with fountains and cafe tables shaded by trees, as well as a pavement decorated with abstract patterns. The avenue also holds the monument to the heroes of the Great War, a tribute to the 50,000 Portuguese soldiers who fought in World War I. Restauradores Square is a large square which commemorates the country's liberation from 60 years of Spanish rule in 1640. In the centre is a patterned pavement surrounding a 30-metre-high obelisk with two bronze figures on the pedestal depicting victory and freedom. The Eden Theatre was one of Lisbon's major cinema theatre buildings, and its imposing facade still dominates the main city square, Praça dos Restauradores. It opened in 1931 and was designed by architects Cassiano Branco and Carlo Florencio Dias. Across the top of the huge facade is a stone frieze depicting stylized actors performing before a film crew and cameras. In the 19th century, Lisbon underwent the normal transformations of an industrialized European capital. In an initial phase, the result of the economic and political climate, the bourgeois romantic city limited itself to instances of urban improvement and embellishment. Agreeable green spaces emerged in peripheral zones, left undeveloped by the Pombelline urbanistic revolution. Formerly known as the Rossio, the centrally located Don Pedro IV Square has been one of Lisbon's main squares since the Middle Ages. Besides the monument of Pedro IV, there are two fountains. In the centre is a monument measuring 27 metres in height. It consists of a pedestal with marble allegories of justice, wisdom, strength and moderation, qualities attributed to Don Pedro IV, whose statue stands on top of the monument.
In my mind, I think of you.
On the north side of the square is the Dona Maria II National Theatre, a monumental neoclassical building built in the 1840s. Situated on the north banks of the River Tagus, the charm of Lisbon exists in its strong links to the past. The tradition of coloured tiles exists in several countries, such as Spain, Holland, Italy, Morocco, and Iran. It's a sort of cross between painting, photography, and comics, and it holds a special place in Portugal. The facades in the Portuguese Pombelline architectural style line the streets. Their neoclassical style reflected Pombell's Enlightenment concept of architectural rationality. The intensive use of decorative tiles covering the outside of the buildings in Lisbon is something the visitor will undoubtedly notice. This usage, intensified by Brazilian immigrants during the 19th century, marks the golden period of tiles covering facades. The first techniques of hand printing and painting were substituted after industrialization by mechanical printing. These tiles have become a peculiarity of Portuguese culture, in which one finds an attraction to the exotic that combines European, Arab, and Indian features. With Pomballine architecture, it was the first time in history that buildings were tested by having troops march around them to simulate an earthquake, making the buildings one of the first examples of earthquake-resistant construction.
In my mind.
The Santa Luzia neighborhood is one of the most interesting places in the city. Santa Luzia Church was the church of the military order of the Knights of Malta. The outer walls of the church of Santa Luzia are covered with small panels of azulejos. This panel shows the Praça do Comércio, Lisbon's capture by the Crusaders, and the death of Martin Monitz in São Jorge Castle. On the wall marking the south side of the square is an azulejo showing a general view of Lisbon. From the Miradouro de Santa Luzia, catch the views up high of the Tagus River and the Alfama neighborhood rooftops and labyrinth of streets. Fado is currently a worldwide known symbol of Portugal. From the moment of its birth, the country has emerged in a crossroad of cultures. This makes it difficult to point out a precise origin of Fado. The most commonly accepted explanation, at least when speaking about Lisbon Fado, is that it came from the songs of the Moors, who continued living near Lisbon even after the Christian takeover. The sadness and melancholy of those songs that are so common in Fado are a good base to explain the rhythms of Fado. Occupying the tallest of Lisbon's hills, the Alfama district brims with the feel of times gone by and is the truly emblematic part of the city. It's still a maze of narrow streets and steep steps, dimly lit taverns, flower-laden iron balconies, and diminutive squares. Almost certainly the best way to see the wonders of the district is to walk through the ancient streets and hills. A village was started here by the Visigoths, and it was a rich district during the time of the Moors. Now it's the home of Lisbon's fishermen. Portuguese tiles adorn the inside and outside of almost every home in Portugal. The Moors restricted themselves to arabesque geometric patterns of triangles, squares and diamonds, probably because many of them belonged to the Sunni branch of Islam, which prohibited images of living things. Portuguese and Flemish artists began to produce tiles in Lisbon in the 16th century. Blue and yellow were the favourite colour combination, and tiles depicted mostly floral patterns or religious scenes. The Alfama is the most historic district in Lisbon, and as such boasts a particularly rich heritage and Moorish past, with some ancient city walls still remaining in places. Much of the Alfama district remains completely intact, as it appeared literally hundreds of years ago, and walking around its labyrinth of winding alleyways, cobblestone streets and Baroque architecture is a little like stepping into the Portuguese past. At the heart of Alfama, the Fado Museum presents the cultural and social influence of Fado since its origins, from its use in cinema through the impact of censorship in the 20th century. It also explains the technical and historical development of the Portuguese guitar and the so-called Fado houses. Santa Engraçia Church has a long history that intertwines with the history of Lisbon, but it wasn't until the 1960s that its beautiful dome graced the skyline of the city. The history surrounding this monument is dotted with bad luck, superstition, torrid affairs, and a prophecy made by an innocent man. This church is also the national pantheon, where the most important Portuguese personalities have been laid to rest. An earlier church that stood on this very site in the 16th century was declared to be desecrated after items were stolen from it and destroyed. The accused thief, a Jewish man, was convicted and executed before the truth came out about the theft. It later turned out that he'd been at a nearby convent where he'd been having an affair with a young novice. Refusing to ruin her to protect himself, he'd kept silent. He was heard to say that any church built upon this land would never be finished because they'd spilt the blood of an innocent man. He was right. Accident and calamity postponed construction of Santa Engraçia Church until 300 years later. It was decreed during that time that the building could not be used as a church and instead remains a national pantheon, monument to the heroes of Lisbon. Just a short distance from Praça do Comércio, heading towards the Alfama district of central Lisbon, sits the Sé, Lisbon's cathedral. With heavy walls and two battlemented bell towers, Lisbon Cathedral has a stern appearance, more like a medieval fortress than a place of worship. This reflected the outlook of Lisbon's new rulers, who knew they'd have to hold the city against attempts by the Moors to retake it. The portals have interesting sculpted capitals with Romanesque motifs. Since the beginning of the construction of the cathedral, the building has been modified several times and survived many earthquakes. It's nowadays a mix of different architectural styles. In the beginning of the 20th century, much of the neoclassical decoration from the interior and exterior of the cathedral was removed to give the cathedral a more medieval appearance. Originally, the cathedral had an inner organization, similar to the old Cathedral of Coimbra. Roman cross plan, 3 aisles, a triforium over the central aisle, transept with a lantern tower and 3 eastern chapels. The elegant Gothic deambulatory was erected during the reign of D. Alfonso IV. It consists of a gallery with a series of chapels, an upper tier of windows, and a ribbed vaulted ceiling. In the 14th century cloisters, in what were once the gardens, excavations have revealed Roman and Visigothic remains, as well as parts of the former mosque wall. The cloister, built in the 14th century by King Dinis, is of ogival construction, with garlands, a Romanesque wrought iron grille, and tombs with inscription stones. The Castle of Lisbon, locally called Castle of Saò Jorge, is located right on top of the tallest of Lisbon's 7 hills in the historic centre of the capital city, above the old Moorish quarter. The castle is clearly visible from a long way off, and it's famous for its panoramic views of the city and surrounding countryside. Inside the walls, there are many beautiful promenades, gardens, houses, a church, and many viewpoints, which deserve a closer and more careful look. The castle's name originated as a tribute to St. George, whose most popular legend revolves around his bravery in saving a virgin from the claws of a dragon. The devotion to this patron saint of England was passed on by Crusader knights from the British Isles, who accompanied D. Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, in the reconquest of Lisbon city from the Moors during the Reconquista. Castles were meant to endure long sieges. This is why, as a last stand, they added a large number of defense solutions, designed to make the invader's task more difficult. Examples are the ground topography, the height and thickness of the walls and towers, the reinforced entries defended by watchtowers and located in several narrow places, arrow-launching holes in the walls and towers, the top shape of the walls, the faults and treason doors, among others. It was during the 20th century that the castle was rediscovered, along with the remnants of the royal palace, the Islamic fortress, and the ancient lifestyle. In the Tower of Ulysses is the periscope or dark room, installed where the royal treasure used to be. The history of the castle is as impressive as its massive presence above the Alfama quarter. Initially built by the Romans in the 6th century, the castle knew battle and rule by the Visigoths and the Moors. Each group added their own architectural flourishes and pieces of their cultural identity to the overall architecture that makes this castle so unique. The castle served as the royal residence of the Moorish king until it was finally captured by Portugal's first king, Afonso Henriques. This castle is a testament to the dynamism of both Portuguese culture and history, standing firmly through generations, shaken only by an intense earthquake that struck in 1755. Castles have evolved in line with weapons technology, but the principles of attack and defense have remained unchanged. Many modern military techniques are simply modernized traditional techniques. The castle is an unavoidable reference, be it in terms of its built structures or for its position as a privileged viewing point, allowing for a visual reading of the growth of the city up to the 19th century. The city lies on the north bank of the Tagus River, about 13 kilometers from the river's entrance into the Atlantic Ocean. From the ocean upstream to the city, the river is almost straight and about 3 kilometers wide. On the Almada side, visitors can see the towering monument of Cristo Rei, similar to the Redentor in Brazil, overlooking the Tagus. The 25th of April Bridge, also known as Bridge over the Tagus, was inaugurated in 1966 with the name Salazar Bridge, after the dictator who'd built it. It was later renamed to commemorate the Carnation Revolution that happened on the 25th of April 1974. This suspension bridge is very similar in appearance to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. It was constructed by the builders responsible for the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Area Bridge. Riverside parks and promenades, elegant plazas and lively cafes greet cruise ship passengers after a scenic arrival past the monuments of Portugal's Golden Age. The tower is an impressive sight and sits on the Lisbon shores in all its well-preserved glory, not far from Alfama. It's evident that the real artistry of Belém Tower lies in the adornment of the exterior. Ropes are carved out of stone, balconies are of open work, and the watchtowers are designed in distinct Moorish style. Below the terrace lies a Gothic-styled interior, which at one time stored arms and was also used as a prison. Built in 1515 as a fortress to guard the entrance to Lisbon's harbour, the Belém Tower was the starting point for many of the voyages of discovery, and for the sailors, it was the last sight of their homeland. It's a monument to Portugal's age of discovery. There are two unique architectural styles in Lisbon: the elaborate 16th century Manueline style, stretching across the Belém district, and the uniform but elegant 18th century Pombelline style, located in the downtown area of the city. The Manueline, also known as the Portuguese late Gothic style, is a Portuguese style of architectural ornamentation from the first decades of the 16th century. The style is well known for its tendency for incorporating maritime elements and representations linked to the age of discoveries and the voyages of Vasco da Gama and Pedro Álvares Cabral. This style marks the transition from late Gothic to Renaissance and exhibits influences of Spanish plateresque style, downtown Italian and Flemish elements. The Torre de Belém has been the setting for many historical events. These included the onset of Spain's 60-year rule of Portugal after the conquest of the tower in 1580. After Lisbon was taken by Napoleonic troops in 1807, the two upper stories of the tower were destroyed and wooden houses built in their place. In 1845, Minister Teixeira had the tower restored to its original state. Torre de Belém was designed by the architect Francisco de Arruda. Before the tower, he'd worked on Portuguese-style architecture in areas of Morocco. Many typical elements of Manueline decoration are clearly recognizable. The coats of arms forming turrets and the railings on the small balconies bear the cross of the Knights of Christ, while the Portuguese coat of arms with a crown can be seen on the main facade, together with armillary spheres on both sides. A stone rope, which on the side facing the land is entwined into a large knot, encircles the whole tower. The Jerónimos Monastery is the most impressive symbol of Portugal's power and wealth during the Age of Discovery. King Manuel I built it in 1502 on the site of a hermitage founded by Prince Henry the Navigator, where Vasco da Gama and his crew spent their last night in Portugal in prayer before leaving for India. It was built to commemorate Vasco da Gama's voyage and to give thanks to the Virgin Mary for its success. Jerónimos Monastery is a prime example of Manueline architecture, a style unique to Portugal that combines flamboyant Gothic, Moorish and early Renaissance influences. The Manueline style was named after King Manuel I, who was a great patron. In fact, most examples of Manueline architecture were built during his reign in the 15th century. The prevailing influence was the success of the voyages of discovery of Portuguese navigators, who brought with them the style and decorations of East Indian, Brazilian and African lands. In architecture, this innovative style is characterized by complex ornamentation in portals, windows, columns and arcades. The most frequent elements present in Manoline decorations are those connected with ships and sea. The more than 182-metre-long western part of the convent complex, in which the Maritime Museum and the Archaeological Museum are housed, was rebuilt and partly restored at the end of the 19th century in the neo-Manoline style. It was deemed necessary to place the Mosteiro dos Jerónimos under the special protection of UNESCO as an endangered world monument. The Hieronymites monks were expected to celebrate daily Mass for the souls of Prince Henry the Navigator, King Manuel I and his successors in perpetuity, in addition to hearing confessions and providing spiritual counsel to seamen and navigators who sailed from Belém. The period of Manoline architectural style lasted for only 30 years, but it made a significant impact on Portuguese history of art. The influence of this period continued for several decades, and it manifested itself in architecture and extended into other arts such as sculpture, painting, works of art made of precious metals, faience and furniture. The style also spread throughout the Portuguese Empire, to the islands of the Azores, Madeira, enclaves in North Africa, Brazil, Goa in India, and even Macau, China. The ornate south portal of the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém faces the River Tejo. There are numerous statues and an amazing number of small but interesting details to be found in this impressive entrance. The ornate main entrance to the monastery was designed by João de Castilho and is considered as one of the most magnificent of his time. This shrine-like portal is large, 32 metres high and 12 metres wide, extending up for 2 stories. It features, surrounded by an abundance of gables and pinnacles, many carved figures standing under a baldachin in exquisitely carved niches. The south portal by Juan of Castile extends upward for 2 stories and is framed by 2 buttresses. The door jambs at the lowest level depict the 12 apostles. The timpana in the south portal has scenes from the life of Saint Jerome above the doorway and the Portuguese coat of arms in the arch between the 2 timpana. Underneath the timpana on the doorframe are medallions representing possibly Queen Maria and King Manuel. The statue of Henry the Navigator stands on a pedestal between the 2 doors. Across from Jerónimos Monastery, reached via an underpass from its gardens, is the Discoverers Monument, built on the north bank of the Tagus River in 1960 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the death of Prince Henry the Navigator. It represents a 3-sailed ship ready to depart, with sculptures of important historical figures such as King Manuel I, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Cabral, and several other notable Portuguese explorers, crusaders, monks and cartographers and cosmographers, following Prince Henry the Navigator at the prow, holding a small vessel.